Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll give folks a couple more minutes to filter in. We'll kick off at the 12:32 marker to give folks an opportunity to filter in. Thanks for joining us. Good afternoon. All righty, y'all. We have a lot to cover, so I'll go ahead and kick off. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Tony Igbenova. I'm the Vice Chair of the Georgia Bar Privacy and Technology Law section, and I'm very happy to kick off part two of our panel discussion on data de-identification and its legal and technical compliance considerations. During today's session, we'll discuss more concepts with our experts, and this includes differential privacy, risks regarding re-identification, and de-identification's role within privacy governance. So that includes privacy impact assessments, as well as contracting considerations. In the second half, we'll run through a few practical examples and further de-identification deployment considerations. So without further ado, I'll allow our panelists to introduce themselves. Eric, I'll let you kick off and we'll go in order of photos.
Yeah, thank you. So Eric Bowman's Chief Technologist at Mirability. So while I am a licensed Georgia lawyer, I'm actually not practicing law. Instead, I'm using that to help on the technical side to make sure that clients are building technology strategies that are actually meeting the compliance needs, whether that's privacy, whether that's PCI compliance, all the different types of compliance requirements. So focus on the technology side, but with a legal perspective.
Kyle Gregory, and I'm an associate in Baker Hostetler's Atlanta office, and I sit on both the healthcare privacy compliance and privacy governance and tech transactions team. It's a mouthful, but my practice is focused on kind of the intersection of health, data, privacy, and so de-identification is right at the forefront of that.
Hi, my name is Krista Marshburn. I am a member of the Global Privacy Office at McKesson Corporation. We have a team of internal de-identification experts, and I have worked within de-identification, well, actually learned about de-identification and worked within de-identification during my whole tenure at McKesson for about a little over 13 years. I lead the de-identification team.
Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Roberts, and I am a lawyer at DuckDuckGo, working in-house and practicing all things privacy law. I'll also introduce my colleague, Andreas Dews, who will be joining us shortly. He works also at DuckDuckGo in privacy engineering, and he will be joining the webinar in a few minutes.
Hi, everybody. Jake Gord here, privacy engineer at Demandbase. Realizing now that I'm a little bit underdressed to be meeting with a bunch of attorneys, so I do apologize for that. But I handle privacy, including de-identification, as well as some compliance engineering initiatives at Demandbase.
Awesome. Thanks for these introductions. And Jake, luckily we're in the tech space, so we're not too fancy on this end. As you all know, I'm an associate at Baker Hostetler, supporting privacy governance as well as biometric compliance initiatives and advertising technologies, cookie compliance, and all that fun stuff. So I'll dive right into the panel questions, picking up right where we stopped from part one. Kicking off with the question of how do organizations balance the utility of data, its usefulness for research and analysis with that protection of consumer and individual privacy. Eric, I'll let you kick us off.
Sure. So I think it's kind of the intersection, right, of what the business needs from just a business goal perspective, the technical capabilities, and then that legal compliance. So how do we, to the question's point, how do we make sure the business can get value out of its data, the data that it has collected over time, but still not run afoul of any of the compliance privacy laws that it's subject to? It really is a risk-based approach where you're looking at the risk of, if we don't follow the compliance, we know what the risks are there. But if we don't even think about the data from that perspective, are we going to create more trouble, cause more harm to the business than it's even worth from a gain on the research or applicability side? So really focused on that risk analysis and how do you think about that data from both sides.
I love the point about risk analysis, and I'm curious about how risk analysis looks on the technical perspective versus the legal perspective. So Liz, maybe you can give us some insight regarding how you go about that risk analysis for the utility of data for the business objective versus consumer privacy. And Jake, after Liz provides us that legal perspective, if you can come in with a more technical perspective of how that risk analysis looks for that utility versus individual privacy, because that's an excellent point. In my day-to-day in supporting de-identification or just general privacy governance initiatives, we're talking a lot about risk analysis. And even though we know what the threshold is, where is that point in which we make a decision and how do we go about that? What is valuable to us on that risk balancing scale, either from a legal perspective or a technical perspective? Liz, I'll let you take that up.
Thanks, Tony. I think the question, the way it's framed, goes right to the answer in terms of it is a balancing act. And I find that what is important is weighing the sensitivity of the data with the aims that the organization wishes to achieve, and then based on that, implementing de-identification techniques and technical and organizational controls that are appropriate in the circumstances to protect the data. And also another factor that's useful is appropriate aggregation techniques and the aggregation level that would correspond to the de-identification used in the circumstances.
And I'd add on there, Liz, I think it's increasingly more important as the legal world gets its hands around privacy and de-identification that risk appetite is revisited regularly. It's one thing to perform a risk analysis of de-identification of aggregate data for an SMB or a mid-market company. But once that organization started to swim upstream with enterprise clients, with healthcare clients, looking at the McKessons of the world, the UNC Healths of the world, looking at the attendee list here, most of those enterprise level contracts are going to have some restrictions on de-identification, further use and aggregation of client or customer data as defined in those agreements. So, in situations where a company maybe hasn't swam upstream yet, they may have certain processes in place to deal with de-identification of client data and aggregating that data, and that might be okay at that point in time. But as soon as we throw one of these larger enterprise organizations into the mix, assuming that data is still sitting in the same bucket, we've introduced some serious problems. So I think it's really important as the organization, the privacy program, the de-identification program matures, that we revisit what is acceptable from a customer commitment perspective. Oh, you might be on mute, Tony.
I realize. Anything else to add from our legal or technical perspectives on that risk balancing point? And if not, I would love to pivot to privacy enhancing technologies as it relates to de-identification and the best ways, whether any of these technologies exist. Can we get examples? And then can we talk about the best ways to implement these technologies within an organization's data processing initiative? So I guess the first piece is any other thoughts on that risk balancing initiative, and then we're pivoting to privacy enhancing technologies for data de-identification.
Tony, I'll add one more item for discussion, and that I agree with all of the other, my co-panelists. But one other thing that we do is to ensure that we're tailoring the level of de-identification to the context and the risk of re-identification. So in addition to everything else that is taking place, we want to make sure that we're not over or underutilizing the techniques based on the context of the deliverable.
I think that's a great point to flag to overutilizing or underutilizing a technique. That's something that we don't give too much consideration to. So thanks for flagging that point within the risk balancing process.
No, and one last point I'd like to add is even taking a step back from the legal perspective, even if you've got the controls in place that you're comfortable with and the contractual language that the parties agree on, especially when you're dealing with these companies providing de-identification to these enterprise clients, what kind of recourse are you going to have if things go south? I mean, just practically speaking, what kind of bucket of money are you going to get from? Like, it's cold comfort if you've got this great agreement that has them dead to rights on X, Y, and Z. If at the end of the day you've got now a data breach and you're kind of left holding the reputational bag.
Such a great point to flag, Kyle. Thank you. Privacy enhancing technologies. I'm curious, and I'll let anyone who wants to jump on this first, like provide any examples or even in practice, how privacy enhancing technologies support organizational de-identification initiatives within processing activities.
I don't mind starting out. One example of a privacy enhancing technology that's getting, that's becoming more prevalent today is synthetic data generation. And of course, that's where we're, mimicking the statistical properties of a true data set, but we want to ensure that, it doesn't mimic the original data set too closely, but we also want to be able to obtain the same statistical properties within the data set. But to implement that, there are tools and techniques that are available to assist organizations in that. It's a useful tool for, generating test data or data that's not needed for, where true data is necessary. But synthetic data generation is one, pet that is becoming more and more prevalent today.
And I think the technology is finally developing to support it, Krista. From my perspective, if you would ask me 5 years ago, I would have said that synthetic data was kind of a race to the bottom in terms of quality. You'd never be able to represent real life statistical data using synthetic data. But I think OpenAI and some of the LLM type organizations are maybe proving that wrong, at least preliminarily. I think we'll see long term, but it seems that they may have cracked that code a little bit.
And that was actually my follow-up question to your point about synthetic data, Krissa, that Jake quite covered on, was just ensuring accuracy. How does that work?
There are the tools that are used, well, the one that I'm familiar with, they embed, programs or processes within that technology that will provide output as far as uniqueness. There are tools that provide like privacy, how it'll evaluate the privacy between the two different data sets. So there are solutions embedded within the tools that will provide that kind of information to ensure that your data, that the synthetic data that is output is accurate enough for your purpose, and also is you're protecting the privacy of individuals that are a part of that original data set.
Amazing. Wow, sounds like privacy by design embedded within these technologies. So Eric, I see you shaking your head a little bit when Krista was providing extra context regarding the accuracy, well, the measures taken within these privacy enhancing technologies in synthetic data. So do you leverage the same type of tools, privacy enhancing tools regarding synthetic data, or are you seeing them used in other ways, other examples?
So synthetic data for sure especially when you're doing something like a development or a test environment where you have to run the same processes, but with people who probably aren't cleared or don't need to have access to the actual original data. And I think there's some ways to the point of you can validate that the synthetic data is comparable to the original data through some of the reports that you're going to run long term. As long as you're doing it in the controlled environment, you can kind of do that side by side. But I also wanted to add to that another privacy enhancing technology. Here on the slide, we talk about automating access rules. There are some products now that you store the original data in, they understand the nature of the privacy of the data they contain. And then basically, when you need to do particular types of extracts, they can actually pull that data out following your privacy rules into a subset of data or a sample of that data that then can be used for those more granular things. And so basically the masking, the fielding, the access control is all built into the original data set. So that when I say, hey, I need a sample of this type of data, I can't see the stuff that would violate the privacy rules or the security rules on that data. So there's basically data engines that help manage that, data governance platforms that understand some of these rules, and those can absolutely help be that first line of defense that data can't even get out of that environment. You still have to do all the other things. You still have to do the some of the statistical, some of the differential things that we'll talk about. But it's that first line that says the stuff that doesn't need to get out just can't leave that core database.
That's very interesting. Did not know that exists. And of course, now I'm thinking about CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and how it relates to, I mean, you mentioned storing data within a database and querying a database and it providing you certain extracts based on our rules and its own knowledge. So, you know, how internally or from what you've seen, how does that work?
And it depends on the product, but often it's actually creating an entirely new copy of that data so that the new copy can be moved to a less secure environment that can be used in that environment. There are versions though that are kind of real time and applying those rules so that everybody is accessing the same underlying data set, but it's masking and filtering it. It really depends on the business case and what you're trying to do with it, especially if you're working with a partner, right? If you're working with a partner, you want that safe copy that is not actually part of your original one so that you're not worried about giving that third-party access to your crown jewels worth of data.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good point, especially in this day and age with how sophisticated hacks and social engineering can be. So I will shift us to our discussion about differential privacy. Um, and this is under the threshold of other technical considerations for de-identification. I know Andreas actually brought up differential privacy, and hopefully he can join us shortly. But Eric, if you can kick us off regarding differential privacy.
At a high level, yeah.
And what it is, yes.
All right, yeah. And somebody else maybe want to pull in some details here, but basically, a lot of these are those statistical ways of making sure we've got all this data. We want to do an analysis of it. We need to make sure that the analysis is valid, but we don't want to obviously have it be re-identifiable. So basically applying those different statistical techniques to shift that data into to larger buckets, less unique sets of data. Maybe anyone else want to add to that just to clarify further?
Yeah, I think the world in terms of de-identification as a privacy enhancing technology has looked at differential privacy as a way to kind of mathematically proof de-identification. We look at things from a de-identification angle, and there's been some research that released that basically insinuates that if you have more than a handful of data points on a specific data subject, it's likely re-identifiable in the current format. So differential privacy provides an extra layer of mathematical support and proofing to that, while, as you mentioned, allowing the organization to maybe reap some of the rewards or the benefit of aggregating that data. It does look like Andrea's here as well.
Yeah, sorry everyone, I'm a bit late there. So yeah, but I totally agree with what you said. Yeah.
No, you're joining at the perfect time. No such thing as late, but please usher us deeper into differential privacy if you have anything else to add or to point out.
Yeah, so I don't know what was said before, but yeah, we're also using differential privacy quite extensively for anonymization or de-identification of data. And yeah, as Jake said, it's basically a mathematical or statistical measure that yeah, treats anonymization from an information theoretic perspective. So more like you would treat like let's say an encryption algorithm. So if you want to compare yeah, differential privacy to other techniques, I think it's best to think of it as some form of like yeah, applying encryption to data or like the same concepts that we use in encryption to data, but preserving some of the utility of the data so that we can still work with it and get meaningful statistical insights while ensuring in a very yeah, strict, rigid mathematical sense that no information whatsoever can be extracted about single individuals from the data set. So, and yeah, it's been a technique that has been around since 2006, which is, has been adopted yeah, a lot in the field, and yeah, the adoption is still growing. So yeah, we see that differential privacy makes its way into more and more use cases, also real world use cases, luckily. So for example, in the US, the Bureau of Statistics uses that for the national census, and more private organizations are adopting it as well as a really yeah, rigid way to prove anonymity in these kind of data sets or data analytics use cases.
Amazing. Krista, anything to add on that point?
Well, I wanted to add for us, internal, the products and services and, solutions that we support our businesses in for de-identification. We understand differential privacy, but for us, it hasn't been a really good solution only because of the, it's not, adding noise is not something that would be helpful for us because our businesses need precision. So just to point out that, adding noise, doesn't support us, but it's good for in other instances, but for us in our internal businesses, because of the precision that is needed, we haven't been able to this point to implement any differential privacy, practices.
Love
Yeah,
it.
that's a great point. Yeah, so like from my perspective, also that's a big challenge for many organizations because yeah, as you said, like differential privacy works by adding noise to the data, and yeah, in many use cases, statistical use cases, for example, it's sometimes difficult to accommodate this fact that your data might be noisy or might be nonsensical in some cases and integrated into your analytics flows. So, for example, in the census, U.S. census, we had cases where different regions had like negative population, for example, and if you as a scientist rely on like the fact that population density will always be positive, then for example, that causes you problems, of course, in your analytics workflow. So yeah, that's definitely one of the bigger challenges in adopting differential privacy.
This is a great discussion. I'm going to shift gears though, because we still have a couple more items to cover. How is de-identification covered within technology transactions? And Kyle, I'll kick that over to you to start us off, and I'll pass it over to Liz.
Well, it really varies. I mean, like where's the data come from? And so normally we see this in a variety of contractual terms, and even sometimes less like kind of quasi contractual terms like policies and procedures that are incorporated by reference. But uh, it shows been a variety of situations like issues that we normally talk about. Uh, the biggest single point we kind of touched on this last time is that we traditionally we'll see terms like de-identification or aggregation kind of thrown around without any real thought to what that means, what the obligations are for each party, and even if what the parties are looking for is possible in this particular situation. And so one of the things that I try to do is try to understand what's the actual, and it's working with the experts here, like and getting a sense what are we trying to accomplish? What's the use of this data? What's the risk here? Are the risks if things go south organizational? Are they reputational only? What's the real? Can we kind of quantify the financial risk? is this, if this data comes out, is it just going to be embarrassing, or are we talking about notifying tens of thousands of people? Are we triggering state breach notification laws, credit monitoring? Are we potentially looking at third party third party actions? Does the law allow for individuals to sue, or is it just it's just going to be an agency or regulator that we're looking at? So just thinking about, and these provisions show up in a variety of places. Sometimes they will be in, as kind of mentioned here, like a DPA, or you'll see it in IP, or sometimes it'll be in the confidentiality section. I mean, there's a lot of different places. There's not a whole lot of consistency on where you start seeing provisions related to data. But one thing that kind of hone in on is what's the definition? What exactly are we talking about? What is the source of the data? Is the data that's being identified what we would consider first party data? Is it the data that the customer is providing directly, or are you de-identifying data that's kind of source agnostic, that's generated by just use of the solution by anyone? Because a lot of times, I'll be working with a client and they'll think, "Oh, we don't ever allow data identification." And okay, I understand. So what's the concern? What's the driver, underlying driver? Or the vendor says, "We need to have this information for our product to work." Okay, well, what exactly do you need? Because I find that more often than not, once we're all kind of singing from the same sheet of music, unless that we're talking about a serious grab of data for a purpose that one of the parties is not contemplating and not on the same page on at all, oftentimes it's changing around the defined terms as easily as that. I know I've kind of talked about it. Liz, I'd be very curious to hear kind of what your experience is being on that side of the fence.
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, I think another interesting point on the data processing agreements in particular is, the limitation under various laws and what they allow companies to do with data. And so, for example, GDPR limits processors to process data only on the instructions of the controller. And then this is often restricted in the data processing agreement. And then there's the issue of if that processor is going to reuse that data for independent purposes, do they run into regulatory uncertainty with GDPR by becoming controllers in their own right? And so, there's been some guidance issued by the CNIL on this back in 2022 about whether processors can reuse data, and there's 4 factors that they have to meet that I won't get into detail here, but essentially it's advisable for companies to provide for this explicitly in their agreements if they want to be able to do this with the data. And then on the other hand, we have CCPA, which recognizes that service providers can aggregate the data across businesses for various purposes, including the service provider's own internal use to build or improve the quality of its services and prevent security incidents. Another area that's kind of interesting is in M&A transactions. So sometimes if data is the driving force of the deal, or if it's a significant area of risk that requires due diligence, and with de-identified data specifically, attention should be paid to whether that data is regulated and then what the laws are that apply to it. And so purchasers would want to confirm with the vendor if they had applied with the applicable regulatory requirements to de-identify, aggregate, or anonymize the data at scale. And if the data set is open source or proprietary, consideration should be given to whether additional software licenses are required to access the data. And essentially it comes down to due diligence, which will inform the key representations and warranties of the deal. And purchasers would probably want to consider including assurances as to the proper generation of derivative data, including whether aggregation or de-identification has been performed properly, and whether data has been utilized according to any restrictions. And then on the vendor side, vendors probably would want to seek to include disclaimers as to whether the data being provided as is, or with all faults and may seek to have the purchaser waive implied warranty of merchantability, fitness, accuracy, or completeness.
Wow, Liz and Kyle, just thank you for that deep dive into specific contractual agreements and how de-identification plays a role. And for all of you who are scribbling notes down, this is recorded and you can find this if you want to refer back to this specific piece to pull in those specific contractual considerations that both of them highlighted. And I think since we're talking about data and risk associated with data, I think it's a great time to pivot to how your organization assesses and discusses de-identification within privacy impact assessments, and whether you've experienced a time where you had to push back on the business or a team regarding their aggregation level or the de-identification techniques selected. I know for me in practice, there's been a time where I had to circle back to the team and say, hey, you know, this is a group of 4. You can't accurately de-identify this data, or you can't accurately aggregate this data, because if you combine other pieces of information, you're able to identify who this individual is. So I need y'all to go back to the drawing board and to see the specific number. At what number is it truly considered aggregate? At what number does this processing activity truly remove identification of individuals and strictly just provide insights? So I'm curious as to your experiences with that.
I'll take the first stab at this. Kind of linking it back to my first comment about vendor contracts and customer contracts. I think on the PET slide, we had a section for documentation and audits, and whereas that might not be a modern privacy enhancing technology, I do think there is some benefit in old school assessments and audits as compared in the context to a PIA. So if like somebody like Kyle internally does a PIA, I often find value in sending the same PIA to the external vendor or to the internal business partner that is requesting, the feature, the function of the product, and make sure those match up both across internal and external lines and then across the contract. Because I always like to say, believe what people are telling you. And if one of the technical folks or a sales engineer or somebody at the vendor fills out an assessment for you, and that maybe doesn't agree with the contract that the attorneys are looking at, maybe in terms of de-identification or further use, that's a big red flag for me, because if the technical folks know one thing and the attorneys know another, there is a disconnect, and there likely is large risk there in terms of confidentiality. We mentioned the access rules from Eric earlier. Something as simple as having service accounts or standing support members in an environment could be considered a breach of confidentiality depending on the contract. And as we all know, most vendors probably do have standing support access to our data, depending on the vendor, depending on the data. And so picking that up in the assessment process and then making sure the contract reflects it, I think is a very valuable use of time.
That's such a great point, Jake. And what I'm hearing too is making sure that legal teams are in communication with their technical teams as both teams are assessing their separate documents, making sure that they're aligned. I love that.
Exactly. Legal definitions sometimes I think are increasingly matching up with the technical definitions. And I think we're driving towards convergence, but we're not quite there yet.
I'm going to add a quick example because I often sit between those two groups, right? Since I play in both roles. We've had engagements where my technical team is saying we don't store any privacy information for that customer, because in that case we were doing like staffing for them, right? So we don't store their data, and we had to remind them that, but we also have their phone number, their email, their name, because they sent that to us, right? It's in our system. So we actually do have personally identifiable information in our systems, but the technical people don't think about that definition of it. They think about, oh, we have a database of that information. So sometimes it can be that simple of how we understand this definition.
Completely agree.
Because we're an internal team to our organization, we have more of a collaborative approach with the teams who are applying the methodologies. Our process involves their coming to us to discuss the project first. They will provide a proposed methodology to apply to the deliverable. We don't necessarily push back, but we work with them to make modifications to their methodology. So, if we see something that is a little bit more risky within what they are contemplating, then we'll provide recommendations around what might work better, protecting the individual's privacy, but at the same time providing their customer and meeting their customers' goals, and it educates them around what to look for as well when they are reviewing deliverables in the future.
Love it. Man, this is such a great panel with such diverse expertise and insight. So, I mean, we only have about, what, 25 minutes left, and I need to wrap the question portions off so we can hop into the practical. So I'll wrap up our question portion before we jump into our panels with, where do you see the needle moving regarding de-identification? I mean, well, the slide deck has not been updated since Google, actually, no, it's up to date. They rolled back on it. Initially, they said they were going to deprecate third-party cookies. Not to toot my own horn, but I think if you go back to I did a PTLF 2 years ago talking about this and knowing they're gonna roll back on this. Ain't no way they're gonna let go of third-party cookies. It's too doggone valuable. But to my panelists, where do you see the needle moving? Death of cookies, how to leverage data without disclosing PI, blockchain. Talk to me, give me some quick thoughts, and then we'll roll over to our practical portion.
Just a quick consensus is developing among ad tech and some of the folks that do leverage third-party cookies in a big way, that context-based identification could be even stronger and more beneficial than cookie-based identification. So regardless of the direction that Google takes, I think ad tech has strong legs to stand on. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I think remains to be seen. But I do think that there is a potentially not as dire of a situation in terms of if Google does roll off of third-party cookies.
And I will be very curious to hear kind of from the technical experts, but I'm always a little bit wary anytime someone's coming with, okay, well, here's the great replacement. The data clean rooms, for example, here's the silver bullet, and it's like, okay, well, what exactly are you trying to do with these? And it turns out, like with almost any other potentially privacy enhancing technology, the use case really does dictate the utility. But that's coming from me more as a interested consumer than from a legal standpoint.
I think coming from a technical benefit perspective, we're seeing a greater ability to link behaviors across devices when not relying on third-party cookies. So I think, in terms of how this is pushing the technical world, I think there has been sort of an aha moment that, maybe third-party cookies weren't the best bet for us all along. Maybe we can get more accurate with context-based identification. From a consumer and from a privacy professional standpoint, that does concern me. Whenever you dehabitat bears, the bears are going to show up at your house in your neighborhood. And I think maybe that's what's happened with third-party cookies. We're pushing into a habitat, and the folks that make a living in that habitat are going to find other ways to do that business. And I think perhaps we've opened that Pandora's box a little bit.
I think, and I'll talk about, leveraging de-identification to, leveraging de-identification and data sharing and maintaining privacy, implementing more automation around de-identification tools, I think would be, it's a good development to keep moving the needle forward, as well as ensuring that we are aware of the context behind the de-identification methods, or the context behind the deliverables prior to implementing certain specific de-identification technologies, and tailoring de-identification techniques to the level of sensitivity around the data, and ensuring that security controls are in place at the same time.
Any closing thoughts on this piece before we move to our practical with our 20 minutes? I did have a quick question for you, Jake, regarding what data elements are involved with context-based ads versus third-party cookies.
Fingerprinting. So that's the wider term that we use for it.
Fingerprinting?
Yeah, and it sounds worse than third-party cookies in some ways.
Good
Now
gracious.
we're going to be looking at things like device ID. We're going to be looking at things like MAC address. Of course, IP address is already being used in some sense for some of this identification. They're going to be used, increasingly more alongside some of these more identifying factors. Whereas before, an organization or a company might have a pretty good idea of what you do on Google Chrome, and they might have a pretty good idea what you did on Edge because you might have logged in with Google on that device as well. Now they're going to be linking across devices, across browsers, across a lot of different channels. For instance, I think we're going to see a world in which data collectors are going to be able to collect data from you aside from your own devices through IoT type devices. There's some new technology coming out with Wi-Fi where you can essentially track movements of an individual through their phone using a Wi-Fi signal. I think we're going to start seeing those things get picked up at the identification level.
Very interesting. Any closing thoughts? And we can move to our scenario. All right, so we have about 15 minutes left, y'all. We have two quick scenarios to run through just to jog where you all are at regarding de-identification and this whole part one, part two, what you've pulled. So we have here, you're working with a data set for a public health study. Below is a sample of the original data and an attempt at de-identifying it. Your task is to analyze the de-identified data for potential re-identification risks. So we'll give our attendees maybe like 5 minutes. I know that's not too much time I would even say like 3, to take this into consideration. And feel free to pop a response in the chat or feel free to come off mute and provide your response. It's a way smaller group than our part one, so we don't bite here. Hop off and give us your perspective. And at the 1:15 mark, I'll turn to our panelists to provide us their perspective on the potential for re-identification of the sample versus the attempt. Give y'all a couple minutes. All right, for our attendees, you have about like 60 more. Oh, we have a response there. Boom. All right. Hannah, whoop whoop to you. Our first response, okay. Data isn't actually de-identified. Need to remove the day and month for date of birth and the zip code. Okay, this is very interesting. Wait, also not sure what's happening to the slide regarding these random green streaks that are hopping on the screen. I don't know what they are. Technology, y'all. We cannot control it. It controls us. But okay, I will turn to Eric and Krissa, if you can kick us off with your perspective and also respond to Hannah. How did Hannah do?
I'll start. So the obvious identifiers have been removed, and and I guess most all of us will agree that that is so. But as Hannah indicated, the full date of birth can be very identifiable. So some method of transformation should also be applied there, whether it's year of, using the year of versus the exact date of birth, or the month of, which can still be, a bit identifiable, but that is better than utilizing the, the full date of birth. Other considerations here would be the gender, the zip code, as well as the date of birth. Because if you combine those three combined, researchers have said that 50% of the United States could be identifiable just based on those three data elements.
Wow.
So again, context is a very big consideration when we're de-identifying. But again, managing the zip code populations. And if the zip code population within a certain zip code is, if there are not enough individuals within that potential zip code, then something needs to be done. The first three digits is, we always recommend that you at least just use the first three digits, but sometimes you still have sparse populations, even within the first three digits. So again, we would say, let's combine some outlying, three-digit zips to further protect, the identities of individuals within these populations. And then again, this is, asthma is not a very rare condition, but in the event there is a rare condition, then that's also, that can also contribute to the identifiability of this data set. So although the obvious have been removed, there are still indirectly identifying information here that can be used and combined to get very close to the identity of an individual.
Love it.
Do a quick add that even just the year alone could be too much information, right? Because especially if it's a person who's 98 years old, right? There's just going to be, that's a very small population by itself. So even year can be identifying for an individual, which is kind of the point. So maybe it has to be bucketed, right? People who are 80 or above, people who are 60 to 80, so that you can get those population sizes back to where they need to be.
So I'll add one more thing with that, Eric. We follow HIPAA. So within HIPAA, the recommendation is for, especially for safe harbor, is no individual over the age of 89. So within our policies, we cut that even lower and say 85. Yeah. So any individuals over the age of 85, we recommend or require our businesses to combine those into one group.
Andreas or Jake, any extra thoughts on this?
I love Chris's point about zip code obfuscation. Bringing that up a couple digits to the 902 level presents a little bit less risk. There is a consideration for zip codes in like 90210, for instance, which is Beverly Hills, is kind of automatically a high risk zip code because it can be seen as extra identifiable. The same with some zip codes in New York, or some place where let's say celebrities or folks are known to live. So I would definitely recommend trying to obfuscate up past like the specific zip code level into more of a geography or region based identification. And then the birth date, is huge. I think the team's already mentioned that. Bringing that out or trying to drop it or obfuscate a little bit more is going to be big for reduced identifiability.
One thing to add, and I think with Craig Paul out on the diagnosis, being aware of potentially event-based items, such as like, especially for public health, like mandatory reporting events where there may be some kind of like gunshot or, I think where there could be some other information generated.
Nice. Okay. In the interest of time, we're going to jump to our next one. Awesome. Okay, literally, we do not know where the heck these lines have come from, but hey, here we are. A retail chain wants to analyze customer purchasing patterns to optimize inventory management and enhance marketing strategies. To compile the report, the retail organization leverages transactional data from its loyalty program, including purchase amounts, product categories, consumer purchasing history, and timestamps. The report also takes in consideration a database of customers that have subscribed to receive specific product updates or announcements. This database includes payment card information, IP address, name, date of birth, geolocation, gender, race/ethnic origin, shopping preferences, and device identifiers. To protect individual identities, your task is to support the team in compiling a final report that complies with the aggregation requirements of the CCPA and anonymization requirements under the GDPR while meeting business objectives. We'll give y'all 2 minutes to provide your perspectives, and at the 23 marker, we'll circle back to Liz and Kyle to provide their perspectives. I'll give another 60 seconds to our attendees. Feel free to drop in the chat or hop off mute like Hannah did. Thanks again, Hannah. And at the 23 marker, Liz and Kyle, you can just hop right onto it. All righty, Liz or Kyle, feel free to kick us off. We haven't got any responses yet.
So I'll start. So in this case, if we're looking at anonymization standard under the GDPR, we talked about in part one a little bit how this is very high and sometimes controversial of whether it can be met at all, where there's a practically impossible chance to re-identify an individual based on the data set. So to meet the standard, we would want to make it as difficult as reasonably possible, as close as we can get to that standard. So direct identifiers, all of those must be removed or manipulated. So they're no longer direct identifiers. And then known indirect identifiers also removed. And then we put in place, technical guarantees to prevent the re-identification of the individuals in the data set.
And kind of building on that from a practical perspective, although we have some background here on what the business is trying to achieve, understanding a little bit of what's been the context around how was this data collected, what kind of expectation the consumer may have had about how this data was going to be used, what do we actually need versus what have we collected because we could, and are we going to use a vendor or a third party to assist us in any aspect of this? of this kind of study. I've talked about it was being kind of internal. It suggested it was internal, but understanding of any, especially when we're dealing with like there's a number of classifications here that are considered sensitive under either CCPA, CPRI, or GDPR. And then, of course, you have payment card information, for example, that carries a great deal of risk, even outside of the GDPR situation context. So I guess I'd probably look at it from a more operational, legal, contractual concerns of how can we kind of balance what the business is trying to get done here while minimizing risk.
Awesome. And to quickly flag the CCPA threshold for aggregation to be sufficient under the CCPA, you have to make sure that the group or category of consumers, their identities have been removed so that it is not reasonably linkable to any consumer or household. So taking away that the name, the date of birth, definitely, that race or ethnic origin and other identifying pieces that can be traced back to an individual or a household, including through a device. Then we only have 4 minutes left. We can hop to the next slide. And Eric, if you can just usher us into these considerations at a very high level for building an analytics database. If you can just point us to maybe 2 or 3 things that you have that you can quickly highlight before we jump into our last consideration.
Yeah, and it echoes a little bit what we talked about before, where you may need to have what looks like a valid database for testing, for development, for all the different things that the business is doing that are not production. How do you get that data extracted out in a way that meets all of the privacy requirements, meets some other security requirements too, because you don't even want production data outside of production. And so it really is that layered approach of adding noise, adding some of the differential privacy that we talked about, so that you end up with a system that you can use for load testing. Is it the same size as production, right? Is the system going to be adequately capable of operating? Is it statistically valid in that if you run reports, you don't get negative populations where that breaks things? So all those kind of considerations go into this, but then having these different layers so that you get extremely comfortable all the way to, as reasonable as possible that what you're producing can't be then later cause a risk to the business from a information leakage or compliance perspective. And you're on mute, I'm sorry.
Classic mute. Amazing. And we'll go through our last consideration. And so I'll have Andreas and Liz walk through this. We'll probably need to take maybe 2 or 3 more minutes of your time. But if we can walk through this, because this is really important as a consideration and as a practical, and this is focusing on protecting user search data. And as you know, both Andreas and Liz are privacy representatives from DuckDuckGo. So this is their range of expertise, and I would love them to walk us through this quickly. And feel free to say next slide, and we'll just press on to the next.
Sure, I can start with that, yeah. So yeah, this is a greatly simplified example, of course, but it's also realistic in the sense that this data typically occurs if you run a search engine or any service really that uses user-based inputs like search queries, and you want to ensure that they are anonymized when you're working with the data. And as we've discussed before, there are like various direct personal identifiers, or let's say indirect ones like the IP address, which of course is not always fully identifying, but can re-identify a user in many scenarios, especially over like a typical search session where a user, for example, typically has like several search queries. So that's something that you want to absolutely avoid in practice, because you do not want to be able, or like the Go at least doesn't want to be able to like correlate any search queries or like correlate them to any real user at all. And of course, the first step in ensuring that would be to remove the direct identifier. So for example, remove the IP address. I think it's in the next slide, then the resulting data set. Yeah, if you can click once more, I think it should show the right side as well. I hope. Okay, yeah. So as I said, like the first step would be removing the direct identifiers like IP address, but even then you have other indirect ones like the country, operating system, app version, that if you combine them together, they would still in some cases be able to uniquely identify a given user within the context of a search session. So you could still form a new identifier and then correlate the different search queries of the user again. And so if we go to the next slide, we need some additional techniques in order to prevent that, which is to use so-called k-anonymity approach. So that means we combine the individual rows of data that we have with all of these different attributes, like the user agent, city, etc., and form groups of users that share these attributes, and then only publish or use or work with the search queries, for example, within the group context of this data. And if you go to the next slide, that will be the last slide, I think. Exactly. So yeah, as I said, we can re-identify these users through like the metadata or this combination of these different attributes that we have. But if we now form these groups, that's no longer possible. And that's can you go one more slide, please, Tony? Please one more, yeah. And as you can see, so the final result of this process is basically a data set that looks like this. You have like a group of queries or like items that you have with corresponding to users that share a set of attributes. For example, here, the country Germany, the user agent Firefox, the city Munich, and the language German as well. And then you have the queries of all of these users bunched together in this group so that it's no longer possible to say which of these queries belong to like a specific user from that group. In that sense, you have anonymized or robustly anonymized the data, and you have ensured that the anonymity of the users in this data set will be preserved. Yeah, and I don't know, maybe Liz can add some legal context on this. I hope it was understandable. We rushed a bit through this due to time, but this is basically, I would say, a realistic process of ensuring k-anonymity in these kind of data sets.
It was an amazing walkthrough, very fast, so people can refer back to this, and we can circle back with any questions that you may have. We're over time at this point, and I know you all are busy people. Thank you so much for joining us for part 2 of the de-identification CLE series, and thank you to our speakers for such informative and relevant content, and thank you all for attending. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone.
Thanks.